The Carter Aquatic Club looked less like a public swimming facility and more like a private resort hidden behind glass walls and trimmed hedges. Sunlight reflected off the water like polished diamonds, mirroring the wealth that surrounded it. Parents sat on white loungers, sipping iced drinks, their conversations floating casually between stock markets and vacation homes. 12-year-old Ethan Carter stood at the edge of the pool, barefoot, his toes curling against the cold tile. The noise was too much. Laughter echoed, whistles pierced the air, water splashed unpredictably. Ethan's fingers twitched as he rubbed his thumb against the seam of his swim shorts, a repetitive motion he used to calm himself. His breathing grew shallow. He stared at the pool, not because he wanted to swim, but because he feared it. "Ethan, you need to focus," Coach Daniel Hayes said, forcing a polite smile. "Just follow the others." Ethan didn't respond. Words often disappeared when fear took over. From the shaded seating area, Richard Carter watched his son with restrained impatience. His tailored suit looked out of place near the pool, but so did he. Board meetings, not emotions, were his comfort zone. "Why is he still standing there?" Richard muttered to no one in particular. A woman nearby chuckled softly. "Some kids just aren't built for competition." Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Across the pool deck, Aaliyah Brooks held a faded towel in her hands. Her swimsuit wasn't new, neither were her sandals. She had been allowed into the program only because her mother cleaned the club offices at night, earning Aaliyah discounted access. She noticed Ethan immediately. Not because of his last name, but because of the way he stood alone. Aaliyah recognized that posture, the way the world felt too loud, too fast, too cruel. Before she could move closer, laughter erupted behind Ethan. "Is the billionaire baby scared of water?" Lydia Reynolds sneered loudly, her blonde ponytail swinging as her friends laughed. Ethan's hands flew to his ears. "Lydia," Coach Hayes warned weakly, though his eyes darted toward the parents instead of the child. Mark Reynolds, Lydia's father, smirked from his seat. "Kids will be kids," he said casually. Ethan took a step back. That was when it happened. A sudden shove. Ethan's small body tipped forward, arms flailing in panic before crashing into the pool. Water swallowed him instantly. The sound of his scream vanished beneath the surface. For a second, no one moved. Ethan thrashed wildly, his movements uncoordinated, terror freezing his muscles. The pool that others saw as luxury felt like a prison closing in. "Someone help him," Aaliyah shouted. Coach Hayes froze. Richard Carter stood up, his face draining of color. "Ethan." But Aaliyah was already running. She kicked off her sandals and dove in without hesitation. The water was colder than she expected, but she pushed through it, grabbing Ethan under his arms as he struggled. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I've got you, breathe with me." Ethan clung to her like a lifeline. She pulled him to the shallow end, lifting his head above water. He gasped, coughing, shaking uncontrollably. Aaliyah wrapped her arms around him, blocking out the noise, rocking him gently. "It's okay," she repeated. "You're safe, I won't let go." The pool deck erupted into murmurs. Coach Hayes rushed over too late. Richard Carter pushed past people, dropping to his knees as lifeguards finally reacted. "Who did this?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp with rage. No one answered. Lydia avoided eye contact. Mark Reynolds shrugged. "Accidents happen." Aaliyah looked up at Richard, water dripping from her braids, anger burning in her eyes. That wasn't an accident. Silence fell. Richard stared at the girl holding his son, this girl he didn't know, who wore no designer labels, who had just done what his money, his power, and his authority had failed to do. Ethan slowly loosened his grip, his breathing evening out. For the first time that day, his eyes lifted. He looked at Aaliyah and didn't look away. Something had shifted. But this was only the beginning. The pool had returned to its unnatural calm, but something poisonous lingered in the air. Ethan sat wrapped in a thick white towel, his knees pulled close to his chest. His eyes flicked nervously between faces, sounds still crashing against his senses. Aaliyah remained beside him, sitting cross-legged on the cold tile, close enough that he could feel her presence without being touched. She understood that silence could be louder than screams. Across from them, Richard Carter stood with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and controlled. Yes, I want every camera feed from the last hour, every angle, immediately. He hung up and turned toward Coach Daniel Hayes, whose face had gone pale. You saw what happened, Richard said calmly, which was far more terrifying than shouting. Why didn't you act sooner? Coach Hayes swallowed. It all happened so fast, I didn't see who pushed him. That's strange, Aaliyah said quietly, because I did. Every adult turned toward her. Mark Reynolds scoffed. She's a child, and emotional. Aaliyah stood up slowly. Water dripped from her braids onto the marble floor, each drop echoing louder than Lydia's earlier laughter. Your daughter shoved him. Hard, she laughed when he fell. Lydia's face flushed. That's a lie. Mark stepped forward. This is ridiculous. My daughter would never. She would, Ethan whispered. The word barely escaped his lips, but it landed like a thunderclap. Richard froze. Coach Hayes stared. Even Mark Reynolds faltered. Ethan had not spoken since entering the program. Richard dropped to his knees again, his voice trembling. Ethan, what did you say? Ethan's fingers twisted in the towel. His breathing quickened. Aaliyah gently shifted closer, grounding him without touching. She pushed, Ethan said, eyes fixed on the pool. They always do. The silence that followed was suffocating. How long? Richard asked, his voice breaking. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Coach Hayes looked away. Richard slowly stood up. You knew, he said, staring at the coach. You all knew. Hayes stammered. We tried to manage things quietly. The Reynolds family is a major donor. We didn't want to. You didn't want trouble, Richard finished, so you let my son drown in silence. Mark Reynolds' expression hardened. Careful, Carter. Accusations like this can backfire. That was when Richard realized something far more disturbing. This wasn't just bullying. This was a system. Later that evening, Aaliyah sat in the locker room alone, waiting for her mother. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Her hands trembled now that the adrenaline had faded. She wondered if she'd gone too far. The door creaked open. Richard Carter stepped inside. She stood instantly. Sir. Thank you, he said. The words stunned her. No one has ever protected Ethan like you did today, Richard continued, but I need you to understand, people like the Reynolds family don't lose quietly. Aaliyah lifted her chin. Neither do people who are right. Richard studied her, this girl with nothing but courage and truth on her side. You may have just made yourself a target, he said. Aaliyah didn't flinch. I already was. At the far end of the hallway, Lydia Reynolds watched from behind a doorframe, her face no longer smug, only cold. And somewhere in the building, security footage was being quietly erased. The next morning, the Carter Aquatic Club buzzed with a tense energy, unlike anything the polished halls had ever hosted. Staff moved quietly, eyes darting toward the security office. Cameras that should have been recording the incident were mysteriously offline. Someone had tried to erase the proof. Aaliyah and her mother, Mrs. Brooks, sat in the waiting area. Mrs. Brooks clutched her worn handbag tightly, sensing the storm that was about to hit. You were brave yesterday, she whispered, but this is going to be bigger than either of us imagined. Aaliyah nodded, her gaze fixed on the pool where Ethan had nearly drowned. I just did what anyone should have done. Not everyone has courage, Mrs. Brooks said, and some people, they punish it. Meanwhile, Richard Carter was assembling his private team in his office, overlooking the pool from the top floor. He had called in legal advisors, investigators, and even an old friend from law enforcement. His son's near drowning had revealed something deeper than a single act of cruelty. It revealed a culture. We need to know everything, Richard said, his voice low and determined. Who pushed him, when and why, and I want answers before this spreads. Back at the pool, Lydia Reynolds whispered to her friends. My father will handle this, she said, but her voice trembled. She had never been held accountable, not truly, not when wealth and influence could erase every mistake. Now, for the first time, someone without fear had seen her. Aaliyah noticed the shift immediately. Eyes that once ignored her now watched her every move, some with anger, others with disbelief. None dared speak, except for one voice. Ethan! He had spent the night replaying the moment Aaliyah had saved him. In his mind, it was more than rescue. It was proof that the world could be fair, even in flashes. He stepped toward her, uncharacteristically clear and deliberate. You saved me, he said, his voice trembling but firm. Thank you. The words hit Aaliyah harder than the shove he had endured. They were raw, they were real, and they carried more weight than any apology she had ever received from a rich kid before. At that moment, Coach Daniel Hayes walked in, his expression conflicted. I need to confess, he said. The push wasn't a joke, it was encouraged by the adults, not just the kids. Shock rippled through the room. The idea that the adults had orchestrated Ethan's near drowning, a calculated test of resilience, of privilege, was unthinkable. Richard clenched his fists. Which adults? Daniel hesitated. The Reynolds family, and others, some who wanted to see what money could hide, to see if the Carter name meant nothing when a child was vulnerable. The room went silent. Aaliyah's jaw tightened, her mother's hands shook. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the pool area. Cameras had caught a fight. Lydia had tried to push another kid into the water, repeating the same cruelty. But this time she slipped, hitting the edge herself. Blood trickled down her temple as shocked onlookers gasped. The scene was chaotic. Wealth, privilege, and untouchability were suddenly powerless against the law of consequences. Richard turned to Aaliyah, eyes narrowing with a mix of gratitude and realization. You didn't just save my son, you exposed a rot I didn't even know existed. And for that, you've changed everything. Aaliyah simply shook her head. I didn't want to change anything, I just couldn't look away. Ethan stepped closer, wrapping a towel around himself and glancing at Lydia, who was now sobbing and humiliated. People can be different, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. And some can be brave. Outside, the sun reflected harshly on the pristine pool, like diamonds glittering over the truth, not just luxury. Aaliyah's heart pounded. She knew the fight wasn't over, but the first move had been made. And in that moment, for the first time, Ethan smiled. A tiny, fragile curve of lips, but it carried hope, courage, and the promise that the underdog could rise. The Carter estate was unusually quiet that evening. The golden sunlight had faded into a warm orange glow, painting the mansion in a cinematic, almost surreal light. Inside, the tension between wealth, privilege, and morality was palpable. Richard Carter paced his office, phone pressed to his ear. Each call confirmed his worst fears. The incident at the pool was spreading, whispers of negligence, cover-ups, and bullying among the elite beginning to leak. And it wasn't just about Ethan anymore, it was about the culture that allowed cruelty to flourish. Meanwhile, Aaliyah sat on the grand staircase, legs dangling, staring at her reflection in the polished marble. Her mother, Mrs. Brooks, leaned against the banister, whispering words of reassurance. You did the right thing, Aaliyah, but be careful, people like the Reynolds don't forgive easily. Aaliyah's gaze didn't shift. I'm not afraid anymore. Someone had to stand up or he could have drowned completely, not just in the pool but in silence. Upstairs, Ethan was finally allowed to join his father. The billionaire, who had been so cold and unreachable, now looked at his son with raw vulnerability. Ethan, Richard began, his voice low, do you understand what you did yesterday? Ethan nodded slowly, his small hands gripping the towel. She saved me, I wasn't alone. Richard exhaled sharply. That's right, and you will never be alone again, not as long as I can stop it. But the real test was yet to come. Later that night, the Reynolds family arrived at the estate. Mark Reynolds stepped out of his luxury car, flanked by lawyers, his posture rigid with authority. Lydia, her face still bruised, followed silently. Richard met them in the grand foyer, his presence commanding, his tone cold but controlled. Mark, this ends now. The way you treat children, the way your family tries to intimidate others, it ends today. Mark smirked, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Carter, you think you can lecture me. You are nothing without your money, without your name. You cannot rewrite the rules of society. Richard's hand hovered near a drawer. He pulled out a small device, evidence from the pool's hidden cameras, preserved despite attempted deletion. The footage played on the wall-sized screen, showing the shove, the laughter, the panic, Lydia's face as she realized the severity of her actions. Silence descended. Aaliyah stood tall beside Richard, her head held high. The rules aren't written by money, she said. They're written by courage and truth. You forgot that. Mark's face hardened, but even he couldn't deny the reality. The pool incident, the coach's confession, the footage, all exposed the rot of entitlement and cruelty. Yet a new challenge emerged. Not all adults would admit guilt so easily. There was tension, whispers, and subtle threats from powerful parents who feared the precedent this exposure would set. Ethan stepped forward, holding his father's hand. People can be brave, he said quietly, echoing the words he had muttered by the pool, and some can be fair. Richard looked down at him, pride and heartbreak mingling. Yes, my son, and that is the lesson they will never forget. Aaliyah felt a strange warmth. For the first time, she realized the weight of her actions. She had changed more than a single moment. She had shifted the balance of power, if only slightly, in favor of truth. The sunset bathed the estate in fiery hues, reflecting off the marble and glass. It symbolized not just the end of a day, but the beginning of accountability. And somewhere in that fiery glow, Lydia Reynolds understood privilege had limits, and courage, even from the smallest voice, could shake mountains. The following morning, the Carter estate was calm, but the atmosphere was charged with quiet anticipation. News of the pool incident had spread beyond the club walls, reaching local papers and social media. The story of courage, injustice, and accountability had captured the public's attention. Richard Carter sat in his study, Ethan on one side, Aaliyah on the other. The boy clutched a small drawing he had made of a pool with a black-haired girl standing heroically beside him. "You know," Richard said softly, his voice uncharacteristically gentle, "sometimes money can't fix what's broken, but people like you, Aaliyah, remind me that courage can." Aaliyah shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't do it for praise, sir. I just couldn't let him suffer alone." Ethan looked up at her, eyes shining. "You saved me," he whispered, "and made me brave." Across town, the Reynolds family faced their own reckoning. Mark Reynolds had been forced to apologize publicly, and Lydia had to attend a series of humility and empathy sessions arranged by the Carter family. Her privileged world had cracked, revealing how fragile entitlement truly was. Back at the estate, Coach Daniel Hayes had submitted his resignation. He had learned that silence in the face of wrongdoing had consequences, no matter the price of wealth. That evening, Richard called a small gathering at the pool. Sunlight danced off the water, but this time, it felt warm rather than threatening. Aaliyah, Ethan, and a few family friends stood together, sharing laughter and cautious smiles. Ethan stepped forward, holding a small trophy he had won for courage, a symbolic award created by Richard. "For bravery," Richard announced, "for doing the right thing when no one else would, and for showing all of us that courage isn't measured in wealth, it's measured in heart." Aaliyah stepped beside Ethan, her wet braids now tied into a loose ponytail, sun-catching strands like gold. She smiled softly. "You didn't just save him," she said quietly. "You made him feel safe in a world that often is." The boy's smile widened, genuine and unforced. It was the first time anyone had seen him radiate such peace. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the pool, Richard looked at the two children, one from a world of unimaginable wealth, the other from modest beginnings, and realized something profound. Life lessons aren't taught in boardrooms or classrooms. They're taught in moments of courage, empathy, and unexpected heroism. Ethan splashed water gently toward Aaliyah, laughing for the first time. She dodged with playful ease, the sound of their laughter echoing across the pool like a song of hope. In that moment, the divide between rich and poor, privileged and marginalized, felt smaller than ever. Aaliyah had done the unthinkable, not for fame, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing. And the world, for just a fleeting moment, had taken notice. The story didn't end with wealth, revenge, or punishment. It ended with growth, understanding, and the undeniable truth that courage can come from the most unexpected places. Aaliyah turned toward Ethan, smiling one last time before leaving the pool. He waved, and she felt a warmth in her chest she would never forget. For some, it was just a day by the pool. For others, it had been a lifetime of lessons learned in a single, unshakable moment.